The deed hit the desk with a sound like a gunshot. Matilda Underwood's fingers had gone cold the moment she unfolded it, and now she stood in the center of the Harlow County Sheriff's office with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The paper was old, brittle at the edges, stained with what might have been coffee or might have been something worse. She had expected to see her father's name. She had expected to see the simple, clean confirmation of what she had traveled 300 miles across the Texas panhandle to claim. What she had not expected, what she could not have prepared herself for even in her wildest and most anxious imaginings, was the second name. There it was, inked in the same careful hand as the rest of the document, dated September 14, 1878. Her father's name, Gordon Underwood, sitting beside another name she had never once heard spoken in her presence, a name that turned the blood in her veins to ice water, Cornelius Harlow, the same Cornelius Harlow whose family had built this town, the same name carved into the stone arch above the bank, the same name on the schoolhouse plaque, the same family that had sent her a letter 6 weeks ago telling her, in the coldest language she had ever read, that her father's land claim was invalid, that the property had reverted to the Harlow estate upon Gordon Underwood's death, and that she had precisely 40 days to cease any effort to stake her inheritance before their attorneys made her life extraordinarily difficult. And yet here was this deed, proving that her father and Cornelius Harlow had been co-signatories, co-owners, partners in something she had never been told about, Miss Underwood. The voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that had learned, over years of difficult conversations, how to be careful without being cold. She looked up from the document. Sheriff Andrew Kendrick stood on the other side of the desk, watching her with dark eyes that held something she could not quite name. He was younger than she had imagined a sheriff would be, perhaps 32 or 33, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that made up the canyon walls outside of town. His badge caught the thin November light coming through the office window. He pulled out the wooden chair across from his desk. Not with a flourish, not with ceremony, just quietly, deliberately setting it in front of her. "Sit down," he said. "I think it's time I told you everything." And that was the moment Matilda Underwood understood that whatever had brought her to Harlow, Texas in the autumn of 1882, it was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more tangled in her own hidden history than she had ever dreamed. She had left St. Louis 6 weeks ago with $40, a single carpet bag, and the kind of determination that people call stubbornness when it fails and courage when it succeeds. She was 28 years old, the daughter of a man who had died with more secrets than she had known he was capable of keeping, and she had spent the 2 months since his death learning that everything she had understood about her father's life in the West was either incomplete or outright false. Gordon Underwood had gone to Texas in 1874, when Matilda was 20 years old and studying at Miss Hartwell's Academy for Young Women in St. Louis. He had told her he was going to manage a cattle concern for a wealthy investor. He had sent money regularly, letters occasionally, and visits rarely. She had accepted this because daughters of her era and station accepted these things, and because the money had been reliable enough that she had not felt the sharp edge of want pressing against her. She had become a school teacher. She had lived simply and honestly and had been, by any measure, content. Then Gordon Underwood had died of a fever in July of 1882, and the letters had stopped, and the money had stopped, and the lawyer in St. Louis had sent her a note explaining that her father had apparently owned a significant parcel of land in Harlow County, Texas, and that she was, as his only heir, entitled to pursue the claim. Then, 3 weeks later, the letter from the Harlow family attorneys had arrived, and the world had shifted under her feet in a way that had never quite stopped shifting since. She had spent 2 weeks in the county record's office in St. Louis before she found a copy of a land grant that referenced Harlow County. She had spent another week writing letters that went unanswered, and then she had packed her carpet bag and boarded the first train south. The town of Harlow, Texas, was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something raw and violent, all wooden storefronts and men with guns and dust that never settled. What she found instead was a town that was trying very hard to be respectable. There were 2 churches. There was a school with glass windows. There was a hotel with a dining room that served real food on china plates. And there was a sheriff's office made of actual brick, which was where she had gone first thing on the morning after her arrival, because she had been told by the hotel clerk, a round-faced young man named P.D. Marsh, that if she wanted to know anything about anything in Harlow County, she ought to talk to Sheriff Kendrick before she talked to anybody else. She had not expected to like Andrew Kendrick. She had expected a man who would dismiss her, or patronize her, or be in the pocket of the Harlow family in some way that would make the whole conversation a waste of her time. She had expected to have to fight for every inch of ground. Instead, he had stood up when she entered, which was not nothing in 1882, and he had listened to her explain her situation with a patience and attention that she found both reassuring, and for reasons she could not quite articulate, slightly unsettling. There was something in the way he listened that felt deliberate, like a man who was choosing every response very carefully. He had asked to see the documents she had brought. She had laid them on his desk. He had read them slowly, and when he was finished, he had looked up at her with an expression she was sure meant he was about to say something unwelcome. Instead, he had opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a large envelope, and from the envelope he had drawn the original deed. The one she now held, the one with 2 names on it. "How long have you had this?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Since I took this office," he said. 3 years. "And you knew who I was when I walked through that door." "I knew your name," he said. "I've been expecting someone from your family to come eventually. I didn't know it would be you specifically." She sat down in the chair, not because she was obeying him, because her legs had made the decision independently. Andrew Kendrick sat down across from her, folded his hands on the desk, and began to talk. The story he told her took the better part of an hour. He told it carefully and without embellishment, the way a man tells something he has rehearsed not because he wants to perform it but because he wants to get it right. Outside the office window, the town of Harlow went about its November business. And inside, Matilda Underwood's understanding of her father's life came apart and rearranged itself into something she had never seen before. Gordon Underwood had not come to Texas to manage a cattle concern. He had come with money. A good deal of money, money that Andrew Kendrick suspected, though could not prove, had been borrowed against the St. Louis house in which Matilda had grown up. He had come to buy land, specifically a 4,000-acre parcel in the canyon country south of town that sat above what locals had begun to suspect was a significant water source. In the early 1870s, water rights in the Texas Panhandle were worth more than gold, because water was what made the difference between land that could sustain cattle in a country where cattle was everything, and land that was just dirt. Gordon Underwood had bought the land, but he had not bought it alone. He had gone into partnership with Cornelius Harlow, who was at that time one of the most powerful landowners in the county. The partnership had been, on the surface, a practical arrangement. Harlow had political connections and local influence. Underwood had the capital. Together they had purchased the parcel under both their names, with the agreement that they would develop it jointly and split the returns. What happened next was where the story darkened. Cornelius Harlow had died in 1879, 3 years into the partnership, leaving his estate to his son, Everett Harlow. Everett Harlow was not his father. He was younger, more aggressive, and considerably less scrupulous. Upon inheriting the estate, Everett had taken immediate interest in the partnership parcel, specifically in the question of whether Gordon Underwood's claim to co-ownership could be challenged or diminished. He had hired attorneys. He had begun a slow and methodical campaign to pressure Gordon Underwood into either selling his share at a fraction of its value or abandoning the claim entirely. Andrew Kendrick paused here. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. "How far did he get?" Matilda asked. "Far enough that your father was scared," Andrew said. "I know that because he came to see me about 8 months before he died. He told me Everett had men watching the property. He told me there had been threats. He told me he was afraid that if something happened to him, there would be no record of his legal right to the land. So he gave you the deed. He gave me a copy. He asked me to hold it and to give it to his heir if he died before the matter was settled." Andrew looked at her directly. "That's you, Miss Underwood." Matilda sat with that for a moment. She looked at the deed in her hands, at her father's signature, at the name beside it. She thought about Gordon Underwood, a man she had loved without fully knowing, a man who had evidently spent the last years of his life afraid and alone and protecting something he believed was rightfully hers. "He never told me any of this," she said. "He told me he didn't want to worry you." "He should have worried me," she said, and there was heat in it, real heat, the kind that comes from grief that has found its angle. "I could have helped him. I could have done something." "Maybe," Andrew said quietly, "but he made the choice he made. And now you're here, and you have the deed, and you have a legal claim that is, in my opinion and the opinion of every piece of law I have ever read, entirely valid." "But," Matilda said, because there was clearly a but. "But Everett Harlow has more money than most small countries," Andrew said. "He has attorneys in Austin. He has friends in the state legislature. He has a judge in this district who has his initials embroidered on everything Everett Harlow owns, metaphorically speaking. Getting your claim recognized legally is going to be a fight. I'm not afraid of a fight." Andrew Kendrick looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not skepticism exactly, and it was not admiration exactly. It was something in between, the look of a man who is revising an estimate. "I didn't think you were," he said. "I just want you to know what you're walking into." The conversation ended there, at least for that first morning. Matilda thanked him, folded the deed carefully into her bag beside her own copies of the relevant documents, and walked back to the hotel. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Then she took out a sheet of paper and a pen and began to write down everything Andrew Kendrick had told her, in order, checking it against what she already knew, looking for gaps. There were several gaps, large ones. The first and most pressing was the question of what exactly the property was worth now, in 1882, versus what it had been worth in 1874 when her father had bought in. Andrew had mentioned water rights but had not been specific. She needed to understand the full picture before she could make any decisions. The second gap was the question of what, precisely, Everett Harlow was prepared to do to prevent her claim from succeeding. The letter his attorneys had sent had been threatening in tone, but vague in substance. She needed to understand the nature of the threat before she could respond to it. The third gap, the one she turned over in her mind last before sleep took her, was the question of Sheriff Andrew Kendrick himself. He had been straightforward with her, and she believed most of what he had told her was true. But there was something in his manner that suggested he was not telling her everything, that he was choosing what to reveal with the same deliberateness with which he listened. He was not hiding things from her in a hostile way. It was more as if he was managing the information, rationing it in a way he thought was for her benefit. And while she appreciated the consideration behind that instinct, she had not come 300 miles to be managed. She fell asleep with the deed under her pillow and woke up at 4 in the morning with her heart racing and the absolute conviction that she needed to go see the land. She hired a horse from the livery stable the next morning. The stableman, an elderly Mexican man named Rodrigo who had lived in Harlow since before the town was called Harlow, gave her a bay mare he said was steady and trustworthy. He also gave her directions to the canyon parcel without her having to ask for them, which suggested that her business in town was already common knowledge, which in turn suggested that she needed to move faster than she had planned. The land was extraordinary. She had not expected to feel anything when she saw it. She had expected to see a piece of property, a legal abstraction, something with monetary and strategic value. What she found instead, after 2 hours of riding south through scrub grass and red rock country, was a canyon that opened up without warning from the flat plateau, a sudden deep wound in the earth filled with cedar and mesquite, and she could hear even from the rim the sound of running water. The canyon walls were amber and rust, and the deep burnt orange of old iron. The sky above them was the particular blue that only exists at altitude on clear November days. She sat on the mare at the canyon rim for a long time. She thought about her father standing in this same place, looking at this same view, deciding that this was worth his money, his time, his distant and difficult life. She thought she understood him a little better, suddenly, than she ever had before. "It's something, isn't it?" The voice came from her left, and she controlled the instinct to startle badly, though the mare shifted under her. Andrew Kendrick sat on a dun-colored horse 10 yards away, watching the canyon with an expression that was quiet and almost reverent. He was not wearing his badge. He was wearing a plain canvas coat and a weathered hat, and he looked out here less like a sheriff and more like a man who simply belonged to this country in some fundamental way. "You followed me," she said. "I rode out the same direction you did." He paused. "Rodrigo told me you'd taken the mare. Does everyone in this town report to you?" "Rodrigo is my uncle," he said without inflection. "He mentioned you'd asked about the canyon land. I thought it might be useful to be here in case Everett Harlow had the same idea." She looked at him. "Does he know I'm here, in town?" "He knew before you finished your first cup of breakfast coffee." She turned back to the canyon. The water sound rose up from far below, clear and constant, the sound of something that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. "Tell me about the water," she said. Andrew guided his horse up beside hers, close enough that she could see the way the canyon light shifted across the planes of his face. He told her about the underground river that surfaced in the canyon, one of only 3 reliable year-round water sources in the county. He told her that in 1880, a cattleman named Prescott had offered Everett Harlow a sum of money that Andrew described only as considerable for exclusive water rights to this canyon. He told her that Everett had turned down the offer because he believed, correctly, that the value would only increase as the cattle industry in the region expanded. "And with my father's share," Matilda said slowly, "he can't sell exclusive rights to anyone. He needs both co-owners to agree." "That's the law as written," Andrew said, "and that's why he wants to eliminate my claim." "That is why," Andrew said. "He has been trying to eliminate your claim for the past 3 years, yes." Matilda looked at the canyon. A hawk circled far below, riding a thermal up through the amber walls. She thought about Everett Harlow's letter, its cold legal language, its veiled threats. "What kind of man is he?" she asked. "Not legally, as a man." Andrew was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone choosing evasion, but the quiet of someone choosing precision. "He believes the world belongs to people like him," Andrew said finally. "He's never had to question that belief because the world has generally agreed with him. He's not cruel for pleasure. He's cruel when it's expedient." A pause. "Which I have found, in my experience, to be considerably more dangerous than men who are simply mean. You've had trouble with him before." "We have a complicated relationship, Everett Harlow and I," Andrew said, and the way he said it made her turn to look at him again. There was something in those words that contained more history than the words themselves. "That's something else you're not telling me," she said. He looked at her then, and for the first time since she had met him the previous morning, she saw something in his expression that was not carefully managed. It was a flash of something raw and genuine, quickly contained, but real. "There are some things that aren't mine to tell yet," he said, "but I will tell them, when the time is right." "How will you know when the time is right?" "When I trust that you'll still be here after you hear them," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she looked back at the canyon. "I'm not going anywhere, Sheriff Kendrick," she said. She stayed in Harlow. She had not planned to stay more than 2 or 3 weeks, long enough to assess the situation and determine whether she needed to engage a lawyer or whether the matter could be resolved through other channels. But the situation, as it unfolded, was not the kind that resolved quickly, and the town, as she came to know it, was not the kind she wanted to leave. It was not a simple place. No frontier town was, beneath its surface. Harlow had been built on land that the Comanche had ceded only under extreme duress less than a decade before, and there were men and women in the surrounding country who had not forgotten that, whose presence and whose dispossession were woven into the fabric of everything around her. The town's economy rested entirely on cattle, which meant it rested entirely on the men who owned the largest herds, which meant it rested, more than Matilda had understood from a distance, on Everett Harlow's goodwill and forbearance. She began to understand this in small and accumulating ways. The hotel clerk, P.D. Marsh, who had been so friendly on her first day, grew noticeably cooler as the weeks passed, until she finally asked him directly what had changed, and he told her, looking at his shoes, that he had been visited by one of Everett Harlow's men and asked certain questions about her habits and schedule. The seamstress who had agreed to alter a dress for her returned it unfinished, with an apologetic note and no explanation. The barber refused to trim her hair, even though she had heard him say quite explicitly to another customer that he cut women's hair, because this was, he said, not that kind of establishment. None of these were large things individually. Together they formed a pattern, a slow, deliberate social pressure designed to make her uncomfortable, unwelcome, and isolated. Everett Harlow was not going to come at her with a lawyer first. He was going to make her life in Harlow unpleasant enough that she left on her own. It was, she thought, actually quite sophisticated, and it made her angry in a way she found clarifying. She went to Andrew Kendrick's office and laid out what had been happening methodically, the way she would present evidence to a court. He listened with his hands folded and his eyes steady. When she finished, he stood up and went to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her, looking at the street. "He's escalating faster than I expected," he said. "He must be more worried about your claim than I thought. What can I do legally?" "Document everything," he said, turning back to her. "Write it all down with dates and times. Keep every note, every returned item, everything. Harassment is difficult to prosecute, especially when the man doing it is doing it through intermediaries, but a paper trail matters." He paused. "And I want you to come to dinner." She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. "I beg your pardon." "I want you to come to dinner," he said again, and the careful management in his expression had dropped away slightly, and underneath it she could see something that was simply, directly human. "My family has a small house on the edge of town. My mother cooks on Sundays. I would like for you to come if you're willing." "Is this a strategic dinner?" she asked. "To make a point to someone?" "It's a Sunday dinner," he said. "It becomes strategic incidentally. The primary purpose is that I would like to have your company." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "What time?" His mother was named Clara Kendrick, and she was one of the most quietly formidable women Matilda had ever met. She was 60 years old, small and brown-skinned, the daughter of a Mexican family who had farmed this land before there was a Texas to be a part of. She had married Andrew's father, a fair-haired Anglo surveyor named James Kendrick, in 1847, and had raised 4 children in a house she had built with her own hands as much as with his. James had died of a heart illness 6 years ago, and Clara had continued living in the house, tending the kitchen garden that produced the best tomatoes in the county, according to everyone who had ever eaten them. Andrew had 2 sisters and a brother, all of whom lived within 30 miles. The Sunday dinner was not a private affair. It was a large, loud, cheerful gathering that expanded to include what appeared to be half the extended Kendrick and Vasquez families, and Matilda was absorbed into it with a warmth and directness that she found both unexpected and, she realized, exactly what she had needed. She sat between Andrew and his youngest sister, Maria, who was 24 and had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. The food was extraordinary. The conversation was warm and real. And Andrew, at this dinner table surrounded by his family, was different than he was in the sheriff's office. He laughed more. He argued with his brother about cattle prices in a way that was clearly a long-standing dispute that both of them enjoyed. He refilled Matilda's water glass without being asked, and caught her eye across the table when Maria said something particularly outrageous, sharing a look of amused exasperation that felt, in its small intimacy, like something being offered. After dinner, while the family settled into the comfortable chaos of an afternoon gathering, Andrew walked with her to the edge of the kitchen garden, and they stood looking out at the late November light falling across the flat land to the west. "Your family is wonderful," she said. "They liked you," he said. "My mother said so." "She rarely says so." Matilda looked at him. "You did this on purpose, didn't you? Brought me here so that the town would see me associated with your family, so that Everett Harlow's social pressure would have less traction." "I did it because I wanted to," he said, "and because it was strategically useful. Both things can be true." "You're a very calculated man, Sheriff Kendrick." "Andrew," he said, "please, you've been to my house." "Andrew," she said, and the name felt different in her mouth than she expected, warmer and less formal. "You're a very calculated man, Andrew. Occupational habit," he said. "I'm sorry if it's off-putting." "It's not off-putting," she said. "It's just something I want to account for, because I'm not sure when you're being deliberate and when you're being honest." "I'm always being honest," he said, and his voice had gone quieter. "The calculation is about timing and method, never about truth." She believed him. She could not fully explain why she believed him, only that she did, in some instinctive and perhaps unwise way that she decided to examine later. "You said there were things you weren't ready to tell me," she said. "Things that aren't yours to tell yet." He looked out at the western light. "Yes. Are you ready to tell them now?" A pause. "Not yet." He turned to look at her. "But soon, I promise you that." November became December. The land hardened under the cold and the sky turned the pale gray of old pewter, and Matilda Underwood stayed in Harlow, Texas, and fought for what was hers. She had written to a lawyer in Austin, a man named Thomas Brent, who had been recommended by a judge she had known briefly in St. Louis. Brent had written back with a detailed and rather sobering assessment of her legal position. Her claim was valid, he said, but validity was not the same as enforceability, and enforcing it against Everett Harlow in Harlow County was going to require either a change of venue or a judge who was not beholden to the Harlow family, which in Harlow County was approximately equivalent to finding a specific star in a clear night sky. Possible, but requiring precise navigation. She wrote back to Brent asking about the possibility of a change of venue. She wrote to the state land office in Austin, requesting copies of all records pertaining to the original grant. She wrote to 2 state legislators whose names she found in an Austin newspaper, explaining her situation in clear and unemotional terms that she hoped would be more effective than pleading would have been. And every Tuesday and Thursday morning, she went to Andrew Kendrick's office and they worked through the case together, spreading documents across his desk, cross-referencing dates and signatures and legal language, building an argument. She had not expected to enjoy this. She had expected it to be grim and grinding and purely instrumental. Instead, she found that working alongside Andrew Kendrick was one of the more engaging things she had done in years. He had a mind that was both precise and lateral, that could follow a legal argument to its conclusion and then step sideways and see the human dynamic underneath it. He asked good questions. He did not dismiss her answers. He disagreed with her sometimes, directly and without hedging, and he was right often enough that she stopped being surprised by it. She found herself arriving at the office slightly earlier than necessary. She found herself aware, in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend she was not aware, of the way he moved in the room, the particular quality of his attention when he was reading something closely, the sound of his voice when he said her name. One Thursday morning in mid-December, they were working through the original partnership agreement, looking for language that would clarify the inheritance provisions. It was a cold morning, and the office stove was burning hard, and the room was warm in that particular enclosed way that makes a small space feel slightly outside of ordinary time. She was reading a clause about dissolution of the partnership, and Andrew was standing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from his arm when she found the relevant passage. "Here," she said, "look at this." He leaned in, and his shoulder was against hers, and neither of them moved away from it. The passage read, "In the event of the death of either party hereto, all rights and interests belonging to said party shall pass to his or her lawful heirs in full and without condition, and said heirs shall be possessed of all privileges and obligations belonging to the original party." "That's clear," Matilda said. "That's unambiguous." "It is," Andrew agreed. His voice was slightly lower than usual. He had not moved his shoulder. "Everett Harlow's attorneys are going to argue that the partnership was personal and non-transferable. That's their strategy. And we counter with this clause. And with the original land grant language, and with the deed, and with whatever Brent can pull from the state records." He paused. "It's a strong case, Matilda." She heard the change in how he said her name, the drop of the formal prefix, and she turned her head slightly and found that his face was very close to hers. Neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she said very quietly, "You have something to tell me." "Yes," he said, equally quiet. "The thing you've been holding." "Yes, tell me." He straightened, put a little space between them, and went to his desk. He opened the top drawer and took out a letter. The envelope was sealed and addressed in a hand she did not recognize, but the name on it made her breath catch. It was addressed to Gordon Underwood, care of Sheriff Andrew Kendrick, and the postmark was from Harlow, dated May of 1882, 2 months before her father's death. "He wrote to me before he died," Andrew said. "This letter arrived after. Rodrigo held it for me while I was out of the county on a federal matter, and by the time I got back and opened it, your father was already gone. He held it out to her. I've read it. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry that I didn't." She took the envelope. She opened it. The letter was in her father's handwriting, which she recognized with a pang so sharp it was almost physical. Gordon Underwood had written to Andrew Kendrick, as a man writes to someone he trusts, directly and without preamble. He had written that he believed Everett Harlow intended to move against him before the end of the year, that the threats had become more direct and more specific, and that he was afraid he would not survive to see the matter resolved. He had written that his daughter, his Matilda, did not know about the land, that he had kept it from her because he had not wanted her life to be complicated by his ambitions, but that if something happened to him, she was the one who should come. He had described her as being, in his words, the most honest and determined person he had ever known. He had written that he trusted Andrew Kendrick to help her because Andrew was the only man in Harlow County who had never done anything for the Harlow family's benefit at the expense of his own conscience. And then at the bottom of the letter, in the slightly unsteady hand of a man who knew he was putting his most private thought on paper, he had written, "I believe she will find you as I have found you, a man worth finding. I hope you will be good to her." Matilda read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands. "He knew," she said. "He knew he was going to die." "I think he feared it," Andrew said gently. "I don't know if Everett Harlow had anything to do with his death. The fever was real, but a man's body can give out faster when he's living in fear, and I think your father had been living in fear for a long time." She sat with that. She sat with her father's words, with the tenderness in them that he had never expressed directly to her in a letter he expected her to read, and she felt the complicated grief of loving someone whose full self you had only understood after they were gone. "He sent me to you," she said. "He trusted me to be here when you came." Andrew's voice was careful. "I didn't know who you would be. He told me you were determined and honest." He didn't tell me you were going to walk into my office and make every other problem I had seem considerably less interesting." She looked up at him. "Is that you being calculated or honest?" she asked. "That," he said, "is both." She stood up, and he did not move away, and she crossed the small distance between them with no plan and no strategy and put her hand against his jaw and kissed him. It was not a delicate or tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who has been carrying too much for too long and has finally found someone she trusts enough to put some of it down. He kissed her back with the same quality of finally. When they broke apart, neither of them spoke for a moment. The stove crackled. Outside, someone rode past on a horse and called out a greeting to someone else that went unanswered. The world continued in its ordinary way, entirely indifferent to what had just shifted between these two people in a brick-walled office in a small Texas town in December of 1882. "I still have things to tell you," he said, "about Everett Harlow, about why our relationship is complicated." "Then tell me," she said. He told her. It came out in pieces, the way things do when they have been held for a long time, and the holding of them has shaped them into something awkward and resistant to release. Andrew Kendrick had grown up on the edge of Harlow County, the son of James Kendrick the surveyor and Clara Vasquez Kendrick. He had been 22 when he had first come into conflict with Everett Harlow, not yet a sheriff then, working as a deputy under an old man named Isaac Pratt who had held the office for a decade and a half. The conflict had begun over water rights, which in Harlow County was where everything began. A family named Ruiz, relatives of his mother's, had held a small rancho on the south edge of county land for longer than the county had existed. When Texas was organized and deeds were issued and borders were drawn, the Ruiz land had been granted legitimately, documented and signed and sealed. But the land sat between two parcels that Everett Harlow had been slowly assembling, and it blocked the water access he needed to consolidate his holdings. Harlow had offered to buy. The Ruiz family had declined. Then the pressure had started, quiet and relentless, the same kind of pressure Matilda had been experiencing, plus the kind that came from men who rode at night and left the language of threat in burned fence posts and scattered cattle. Eventually, a fire had destroyed the Ruiz house. No one had been hurt because they had had enough warning to get out, but the house was gone and the family had left. Andrew had investigated. He had found evidence he believed pointed clearly at men working for Everett Harlow. He had brought it to his superior, Isaac Pratt, who had looked at the evidence and looked at Andrew and told him that there were limits to what a deputy's ambition should reach. The case had gone nowhere. Isaac Pratt had retired the following year. Andrew had run for the office. He had won, partly on the strength of his family's connections in the community, partly because there was a faction in Harlow who were tired of seeing the Harlow family treated as if the laws of the county were a document they had authored for their own convenience. He had won, and he had spent 3 years as sheriff doing his job exactly as he understood the law to require, and he and Everett Harlow had maintained a kind of armed peace in which each knew exactly where the other stood. When Gordon Underwood had come to Andrew's office 8 months before his death, frightened and alone and asking for help, Andrew had given it without hesitation. Because Gordon Underwood was a man who was being pushed around by Everett Harlow, and Andrew Kendrick had strong feelings about that pattern. "You have a personal stake in this," Matilda said when he finished. "Yes," he said, simply and without apology. "That doesn't compromise your ability to help me. It means you understand what I'm dealing with. That's how I see it." He paused, "But I wanted you to know it, because I didn't want you thinking I was purely disinterested." "I never thought you were purely disinterested," she said. "I just didn't know where the interest lived." She reached out and took his hand, and they sat together in the warmth of the office while the December wind came down off the plateau and rattled the windows. Christmas passed quietly. Matilda spent it with Andrew's family, and it was the first Christmas she had not spent alone in 3 years, because the last 2 before this one, her father had been in Texas and she had been in St. Louis, and the distance between them had been too great and too expensive to cross for a holiday. She sat at Clara Kendrick's table and ate tamales and bread pudding and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was somewhere she might choose to stay. In January of 1883, Everett Harlow made his next move. He did not make it subtly. He filed a formal legal challenge to the partnership deed, asserting through his Austin attorneys that Gordon Underwood's signature had been obtained under duress and was therefore invalid, and that the land had in fact always been solely the property of the Harlow family. It was a bold claim, almost reckless in its overreach, and Matilda thought she understood why he was making it. He was forcing the issue into the courts before she could build her case more thoroughly. He was betting that he could overwhelm her with legal resources before she could match him. She wrote immediately to Thomas Brent in Austin, who wrote back within the week to say he was on his way. Thomas Brent was a tall, spare man of 45 with a silver streak in his dark hair, and the kind of self-contained energy that distinguished the kind of lawyer who won cases from the kind who simply filed them. He arrived on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, he and Matilda and Andrew were sitting around Andrew's desk going through everything they had. Brent was impressed by the documentation. He was even more impressed by the letter from Gordon Underwood. "This is extraordinary," he said, holding it carefully. He anticipated the challenge. He specifically articulated his understanding of the inheritance provisions. If we can establish this letter as authentic and prior to the challenge, it significantly undermines their duress argument. "It's in my father's hand," Matilda said. "I have other letters he wrote me for comparison." "Good." Brent set the letter down. "The duress argument is interesting because it's a two-edged blade. If they claim Underwood signed under duress, the implication is that someone was pressuring him, which opens the door to asking who was doing the pressuring." "Everett Harlow," Andrew said. "Possibly." Brent allowed himself a small, precise smile, which would be a remarkable thing to have on the record. The legal proceedings moved with the slowness that characterized Texas county courts in 1883, which is to say they moved like cold honey. There were filings and counter-filings and requests for documents and objections to requests for documents, and a continuous low-level battle over jurisdiction that Brent conducted with patient and inexhaustible technical skill. Matilda learned more about property law in those months than she had imagined she would ever need to know. She also learned that the process of sitting in a lawyer's office reading depositions was considerably less romantic than the novels made it out to be, and considerably more important. Through February and into March, Everett Harlow escalated in ways that were now clearly designed to intimidate rather than to persuade. His men were visible in town in greater numbers. One evening someone threw a rock through the window of Andrew's office while Matilda was inside, and though the rock itself was harmless, the message it carried was not. Andrew had filed a report and replaced the window glass without visible agitation, but Matilda had seen the way his jaw had set when he looked at the broken glass on the floor, and she understood that his calm was a choice he was making, not a state he was in. She made a decision. She went to the hotel where Brent was staying and found him in the dining room with his evening coffee and told him that she wanted to attempt a negotiation with Everett Harlow directly. Not to settle, she was careful to clarify, not to give anything up, but to make clear face to face that she was not going to be frightened away and to assess the man in person. Brent looked at her over his coffee cup with an expression of someone who is deciding whether to argue. "It's risky," he said. "I know that." He may see it as weakness, a willingness to compromise. "Only if I present it that way," she said. "I'll present it as information. I want him to know that I know everything my father knew and more, and that his strategy of attrition is not going to work because I'm not here on a temporary basis." Brent considered. "I'll need to be present. I expected that," she told Andrew that evening. He was quiet for a moment and she could see him working through the risks, the same methodical process she had come to recognize. "I'll be there," he said. "You don't have to be." "I know," he said. "I'm choosing to be." The meeting took place on a Friday morning in March, in the parlor of the Harlow house, which was the largest private residence in the county, a white-painted structure at the north edge of town that looked more like an attempt to transplant Virginia plantation aesthetics into Texas geography than anything that grew organically from its surroundings. The parlor was furnished elaborately and without warmth, full of expensive things that had been bought to impress rather than because anyone in the house particularly wanted them. Everett Harlow was not what she had imagined. She had imagined someone villainous in an obvious way, sharp-featured and cold-eyed. What she found was a man of perhaps 50, with a broad, fleshy face and the kind of surface affability that in her experience indicated a personality that had never needed to develop genuine warmth because money had always served the same social purpose. He was not ugly and not handsome and not particularly frightening to look at. He reminded her, obscurely, of a very large cat that had eaten recently and was therefore temporarily benign. "Miss Underwood," he said, when she was shown in. He stood. His eyes went past her to Andrew, and something shifted in them, something quick and calculating that he tucked away immediately. "Sheriff, Mr. Harlow," Andrew said, with the particular tone he used for legal formality, which was identical to his regular tone except slightly cooler. They sat. Brent was beside Matilda. One of Harlow's Austin lawyers was in a chair by the window. The room was quiet in the way of rooms where expensive silence has been installed deliberately. Matilda spoke first. She had written out what she intended to say, and she had rehearsed it. Not to sound rehearsed, but to know it well enough that she could say it naturally and completely and not be deflected from any part of it. She told Everett Harlow that she had the original deed, the letter, the partnership agreement, and the full documentation of the water rights provisions. She told him that Thomas Brent had filed for a change of venue to the Travis County Court in Austin, where the judge was not among his acquaintances. She told him that she had been in correspondence with a journalist in Austin who was interested in the history of property disputes in Harlow County and the role of the Harlow family in them. This last point was the one that landed most visibly. A journalist. Matilda watched the affable surface of Everett Harlow's face strain slightly, like ice over moving water. "That is your right, of course," he said. His voice had gone slightly more careful. "I wonder, however, whether a legal matter of this complexity is really something to be aired in the newspapers." "I'm not sure I have any alternative," Matilda said. "The pattern of harassment directed at me since my arrival in this town has been considerable. I have documented all of it. I find that when things are documented and made public, the pattern tends to stop." A silence. "I think," Everett Harlow said, "that there may have been some misunderstanding about the nature of my family's claim." "I don't think there has been," Matilda said pleasantly. "I think the claim has been stated quite clearly by your attorneys, and I think mine has been stated quite clearly by mine. I came here today not to negotiate a resolution but to make one thing clear. I am not leaving Harlow, and I am not dropping my claim, and every strategy you have employed to make me do either of those things is going to be documented and, if necessary, publicized." She paused. "That's all I wanted to say." She stood. Brent stood. Andrew stood. Everett Harlow looked up at her from his chair, and in his eyes she saw the calculation happening, the weighing of costs, the revision of his assessment of who and what she was. "You're Gordon Underwood's daughter," he said finally, not as an accusation, almost, she thought, as something approaching respect from a man who had very few categories for respect. "Yes," she said, "I am." They left. Outside, in the pale March sunshine, Andrew fell into step beside her and Brent walked ahead, and after a moment Andrew said quietly, "The journalist." "I wrote to one," she said. "Whether he writes anything is up to him." "You never told me that." "I didn't decide to tell Harlow until I was sitting in that room," she said. "I wanted to see his face when he heard it." Andrew looked at her sideways, and the expression on his face was not quite a smile but was something adjacent to one, something that was warm and slightly awed and entirely genuine. "You are exactly what your father said you were," he said. "What did he say I was?" "Honest and determined," Andrew said. He didn't say formidable. I think he might not have known that part. Spring came to the Texas Panhandle with the urgency of a season that knows it has a limited window before summer arrives and burns everything back. The grasses came up green and fast in the canyons. The creek in the canyon below the property boundary ran high with snowmelt from the plateau. The mesquite came into leaf, and the canyon wrens sang from the rock walls, and Matilda Underwood walked the boundary of her father's land and began, tentatively and with enormous uncertainty, to think of it as her own. The legal proceedings in Austin were moving. Brent sent regular letters. The change of venue had been granted, which was itself a kind of victory, because it meant the case was now before a judge who had no personal or financial relationship with the Harlow family. Everett Harlow's attorneys were still fighting on every front, but the shape of the fight had changed. It was more defensive now, less confident. The duress argument was struggling under the weight of Gordon Underwood's letter, which Brent had entered into the record with a scholarly footnote about handwriting authentication that made the letter effectively bulletproof as evidence. Everett Harlow had stopped the visible harassment. Whether this was because of Matilda's visit, or the journalist, or the change of venue, or some combination of all of them, she couldn't say. The hotel clerk, P.D. Marsh, was friendly again. The seamstress had sent a note apologizing for the unfinished dress. The barber had remained intransigent, but Matilda had decided she didn't particularly need the barber. She and Andrew had, with the particular care and uncertainty of two people who have both been independent long enough to be nervous about what connection requires, begun something. It was not a courtship in the formal sense, with calls and chaperones and the elaborate social choreography of it. It was more like two people who had decided to trust each other and were discovering, day by day, what that trust revealed. He took her riding on Sunday mornings, out through the canyon country, showing her the land she was fighting for and the country around it. He was, she discovered, a man who loved this landscape with a depth that was not romantic in the sentimental sense, but was rooted in genuine knowledge of it, in the names of the plants and the habits of the animals, and the way the light changed through the seasons. She found that listening to him talk about the land was one of her favorite things, which surprised her, because she had not thought of herself as someone who would care deeply about landscape. She told him things she had not told other people. She told him about her mother, who had died when Matilda was 14, and whose absence had shaped her in ways she was still uncovering. She told him about the years at Miss Hartwell's academy, which had been excellent in practical terms and stifling in every other way. She told him about the long, quiet years of being a schoolteacher in St. Louis, which had been meaningful but which had also been, she admitted to herself only in this new honesty, lonely in a way she had learned to reframe as independence. He listened to all of it. He did not offer solutions or tell her how she should have felt about any of it. He just listened, and occasionally he asked a question, and the questions were always the kind that indicated he had genuinely heard what she said. In April, she went to the land office in town and filed the necessary paperwork to begin formally assessing the property. She hired a local man named Guillermo Fuentes to survey the boundaries, because Rodrigo at the livery had suggested him, and because he was excellent at his work, and because she liked the fact that he was the grandson of a Comanche woman who had known this canyon land for generations before any deed with any names on it existed, and that his knowledge of the property boundaries was based on a kind of understanding that went considerably deeper than a surveyor's transit and chain. Guillermo walked every inch of the 4,000 acres with her. He showed her the places where the underground water surfaced in springs that weren't on any official map. He showed her the canyon walls where his grandmother's people had painted symbols he said meant, in the loose translation he offered, something between water lives here, and this place is alive. He showed her where the best grass grew in the canyon bottom, where cattle would thrive. He showed her where a house might sit to catch the morning sun and be sheltered from the north wind by the canyon walls above. She stood in that particular spot and looked up at the amber walls and the blue sky between them, and she thought about building something. She had not come here to build something. She had come to claim what was hers and then decide what to do with it. But standing in the canyon with the sound of water and the smell of cedar and the light falling warm on the red rock, she understood that she was not going to sell this land or lease it or treat it as a financial instrument. She was going to stay. This was where she wanted to be. She told Andrew that evening. They were sitting on the bench outside his office in the late afternoon light, which had become a habit without either of them formally declaring it one. The town moved around them in its early evening way, the day's business winding down, the supper smells drifting from the hotel kitchen, the horses growing quiet in the livery. "I'm going to build a house," she said, "on the canyon land when the legal matter is settled." He did not look surprised. He nodded slowly with the expression of someone who is hearing a thing confirmed that they had already suspected. "It's good land for a house," he said. "Guillermo showed me the spot. It's perfect." A pause. He was looking at the middle distance, at something in the western sky. "When you say you're going to build a house," he said carefully, "what is the shape of the life you're imagining goes inside it?" She looked at him. He turned to look at her. "I'm asking," he said, "because I would like to know whether there's a place in it for a sheriff who is working on improving his conversation skills and who can, at minimum, promise that he will never let Everett Harlow give you any further trouble." "A sheriff," she said. "An imperfect one," he said, "who is considerably more uncertain about his own good qualities than about the work of the law." "You are the most methodical, careful person I have ever met," she said. "And you are asking me this by way of describing yourself as uncertain. The uncertainty is specifically about whether I am someone you would want to build a life with," he said. "The professional competence is a separate question." She looked at him for a long moment, this man with the steady dark eyes and the careful voice, and the life built around doing his job honestly in a place where doing it honestly was not always the easiest choice. This man who had held her father's secret and her father's trust, and had delivered both to her with care. This man who had kissed her back in December with the feeling of something finally, and had not flinched from anything she was since. "Andrew," she said, "I am building this house so that something permanent is possible. You are the only person I have met in Harlow, including Rodrigo and Brent and Guillermo and your wonderful mother and all your chaotic family, with whom I can imagine permanent." He let out a breath. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it. "I am going to court you properly," he said. "I want you to know that, with your full knowledge and consent and in whatever way you find agreeable. I am not going to assume anything." "That is a very carefully managed declaration," she said. "I am working on being less managed," he said, and his thumb moved across the back of her hand, and it was not managed at all. "Work faster," she said, smiling. The legal case in Austin was heard in May of 1883. Matilda and Andrew traveled to Austin by train, along with Brent and a small collection of documents that Matilda had come to think of, with the dark humor of someone who has spent too long on a legal case, as her most important possessions. Clara Kendrick had pressed food on them before they left, and Maria Kendrick had hugged Matilda with a fierceness that suggested she considered the outcome a family matter. The court proceedings lasted 4 days. Matilda sat in the gallery and watched Thomas Brent do the work she had hired him to do, with a precision and confidence that justified every penny of his considerable fee. The Harlow attorneys were skilled, but the duress argument had been weakened almost to the point of invisibility by Gordon Underwood's letter, and the partnership deed was, as Brent had said from the beginning, unambiguous. The inheritance provision was clear. The original land grant language was clear. The only remaining question was whether the court would find any reason to look past what was written and rule on some other basis. It did not. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the judge read his ruling. Matilda's claim was valid. The land was hers. The partnership interest her father had held had passed to her as his legal heir, in full and without condition, precisely as the agreement specified. Everett Harlow's challenge was dismissed. She sat in the gallery and heard the words and felt something shift in her chest, some weight she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. Andrew was beside her in the gallery. When the ruling was read, he turned to look at her. She was not crying, though her eyes were bright. She was sitting very straight with her hands folded in her lap, and her chin up in the way she had learned meant she was feeling something very large and was deciding how to let it take up space. He put his hand over hers. That was all. She turned her palm up and held his hand. They had dinner that evening in an Austin restaurant that was finer than anything Harlow offered, with a menu and actual napkins and wine, which was a luxury Matilda had not permitted herself since St. Louis. Brent toasted her success with obvious, genuine pleasure, because he was the kind of lawyer who actually cared about outcomes, which was the primary reason she had chosen him. After dinner, Brent took his leave and went back to his hotel room, and Matilda and Andrew walked along the Congress Avenue street in the warm May evening, among the lights and the city noise, which was both familiar and strange to her, a reminder of St. Louis and of a life she had lived before this one. "I don't miss it," she said without preamble. "The city, the life I had before. The city is part of it, but mostly the life. I thought I might, coming back to something like this. I don't." "What do you miss?" he asked. She thought about it seriously. "My mother," she said. "I miss what my father might have been if he hadn't been afraid. I miss having known him better when I had the chance." She paused. "I miss the version of my childhood that might have been simpler, but not the life I actually built. I don't miss any of that." "What do you want?" he asked. She stopped walking and turned to look at him on the wide street with the Texas night around them and the smell of the Colorado River drifting from a few blocks south. "I want to go home," she said. "To Harlow." He smiled. It was not the careful near smile she had seen in the early months. It was a real smile, open and warm, and it changed his face entirely. "Then let's go home," he said. Back in Harlow, the summer of 1883 was the best summer she had experienced in a decade, which she would later say was because it was the summer she stopped waiting for her life to begin and simply began it. She hired Guillermo and 3 other men to begin construction on the house in the canyon. She had drawn the plans herself, over many evenings at Andrew's kitchen table, with his input on the structural elements and her own very firm opinions about the light and the space and the number of windows. It was to be a solid stone house, built with the canyon rock, with a pitched roof and a wide porch facing south toward the canyon rim, and a kitchen large enough to work in properly. It was going to take 6 months to build, and she was going to be there for every day of it. She moved out of the hotel and into a temporary structure on the property, a converted ranch outbuilding that Guillermo and his crew had made weather-tight and habitable, with a real stove and a proper door. She cooked her own meals and rode her horse and supervised the construction and wrote letters to Thomas Brent, tying up the remaining legal threads, and corresponded with her acquaintance in Austin, who had indeed become a journalist interested in the story. Andrew came out to the property twice a week, and on the weeks when he could manage it, 3 times. He helped with what he could help with. He ate dinner with her in the small outbuilding with the stove going, and they talked about everything and nothing, and it was comfortable in a way that surprised her because she had not known she was capable of this kind of comfortable intimacy. She had been alone long enough to believe she was constitutionally suited to it. She was learning that summer that she was not. He had still not asked her anything formal. She had told him she was patient. She was not entirely patient. But she understood, because she had come to understand him, that he was working through something inside himself, something about whether he deserved this, about whether what he could offer was enough for what she was. She did not push because she knew pushing would not help. She simply continued to be present and honest and to let him see, every time he came out to the property, that she was choosing to be there. On an evening in September, when the house was half built and the walls were chest-high in raw canyon stone, and the evening light was falling warm and golden through the gap in the canyon rim, Andrew sat with her on the south-facing ledge of rock that would one day be the porch foundation. He had brought food from his mother, a habit Clara had developed early and showed no sign of abandoning, and they had eaten and were sitting in the particular quiet that falls after a good meal in a beautiful place. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. He turned to face her. He was not managed. He was not calculated. He was, she realized, slightly nervous, which she found unexpectedly endearing in a man who handled sheriffing with such complete composure. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to ask you because I love you, and because I would like to build this life with you, not just watch you build it. I want to ask you because this is where I want to be, and because I think you are the best person I have ever known, and because your father's letter told me you were worth finding, and I have found that he was, as in most things, entirely correct." She looked at him. "That was the most complete proposal I have ever heard," she said, "or read about, or imagined." "I practiced it," he said. "I can tell. Is that bad?" "Andrew," she said, and took his face in both her hands the way she had done that first time in December in the office. "I would be very happy to marry you." He kissed her, and it was different from the first time, not the kiss of something finally, but the kiss of something beginning, which is its own and better thing. They were married in November, 1 year almost to the day after Matilda had walked into Andrew Kendrick's office with a carpet bag and a deed, and a determination that she had not yet known what to do with. The wedding was in the Harlow Methodist Church, which was the smaller of the two churches, and therefore the one with the warmer congregation, and it was attended by nearly everyone in town, because Harlow was the kind of town where a wedding was an occasion, and because Matilda and Andrew together were the kind of people who, over the course of a year, had quietly become important to the community in ways that went beyond his badge and her legal battle. Clara Kendrick stood in the front pew and cried without embarrassment, and then laughed at herself for crying, which Matilda thought was among the most human things she had ever witnessed. Maria Kendrick was bridesmaid with such dramatic enthusiasm that several people had to suppress smiles during the ceremony. Thomas Brent had come from Austin for the occasion and stood in the back looking satisfied in the way of lawyers who have won difficult cases and then gotten to attend the wedding. Rodrigo sat in the middle of the congregation with his wife and looked quietly pleased. Guillermo Fuentes had finished the house in October, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, because Matilda Underwood was the kind of project manager who created an atmosphere in which people wanted to do their best work. The house was everything she had planned it to be, stone-walled and solid, south-facing, with the wide porch looking out over the canyon rim and the big kitchen, and the windows that filled every room with the particular amber and gold of canyon light. She had furnished it simply and well, with things that were comfortable rather than impressive, and she had put her father's deed, framed on the wall beside the fireplace in the main room. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. The night after the wedding, they came home to the canyon house for the first time together. The November stars over the canyon were extraordinary, dense, and brilliant in the cold, clear sky, the kind of stars you only see far from cities. They stood on the porch and looked up at them. "Your father would have been very pleased," Andrew said. "He would have been insufferably smug about it," Matilda said. "He told you she'd find you worth finding. That's a man preparing himself to be right." Andrew laughed, and the sound of it went out over the canyon and came back softened and warm. "I want to tell you something," he said. "More secrets." She turned to look at him, and there was warmth in it, not the old wariness. "Not a secret, just something I haven't said properly." He took her hand and looked at her directly with those dark, steady eyes that she had learned to read over the past year, that she now understood as clearly as she understood her own. "I was doing my job when you came to my office. I was keeping my promise to your father, doing right by a man who had trusted me. And then you walked in, and within about 4 minutes I understood that whatever happened next, I was not going to be doing it from a position of neutrality." 4 minutes, she said. "That's quite specific." "It was when you found the second name on the deed," he said. "The way you looked, not frightened, not confused, just absolutely determined to understand." Shook his head slightly. That was when I pulled out the chair. She thought about that first morning, the deed landing on the desk, the cold shock of seeing Cornelius Harlow's name, the sheriff who had pulled out a chair and sat across from her and told her everything he knew, everything he had held and waited and promised to give to whoever Gordon Underwood sent. "You told me everything," she said. "I told you everything I knew then," he said. "I've been telling you more ever since." "You have," she agreed. "I intend to continue." "Good," she said, "because I intend to keep asking." She leaned against him, and his arm came around her, and they stood together on the porch of the stone house with the canyon below, and the stars above, and the sound of the underground river rising through the dark in its ancient and perpetual way. The winter was quiet and good. They fell into the rhythms of the house and each other, the morning routines and the evening conversations and the practical textures of a shared life. Andrew rode into town for his work and came home at the end of his days. Matilda had been approached by the school board about the teaching position, which had been without a permanent occupant since the previous spring, and she had taken it with the kind of pleasure that comes from doing work you are genuinely suited for in a place you have chosen to be. She loved teaching. She had always loved it, but teaching in Harlow was different from teaching in St. Louis, because the children were different, more varied in their backgrounds and their circumstances, with a mix of Anglo and Mexican, and the occasional Apache child from the families who had stayed in the region, all of them fitting their learning into the framework of a small frontier school that had limited resources and enormous need. She threw herself into it. She wrote to educational contacts in Austin and St. Louis. She acquired books. She wrote a grant request to the state education fund that was funded, which pleased her immensely. By spring, she knew she was expecting a child. She told Andrew on a Sunday morning in March, over coffee at the kitchen table, in the matter-of-fact way she did most things, because she was not someone who required elaborate performance for significant moments. She said, "I believe we're going to have a child by September." He went absolutely still. Then his face broke into an expression she had never seen on it before, something wide open and unguarded and joyful, and he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her in his arms and held her. "September," he said into her hair. "Give or take," she said. "I'll ask the doctor in town to confirm." He pulled back to look at her. His eyes were bright. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "Slightly unreliable in the mornings," she said, "but otherwise entirely capable." She reached up and touched his jaw. "You look rather undone." "I am rather undone," he said, without any self-consciousness about it. "This is the best news I have ever received." The pregnancy was straightforward, because Matilda was constitutionally practical and refused to treat her body as a problem to be managed from a reclining position. She continued teaching through June, when the heat became significant enough that she agreed to rest more. She continued riding, carefully, and walking the canyon, and supervising the kitchen garden she had started in the spring. Andrew was attentive without being anxious, which was exactly what she needed. He checked in without hovering. He adjusted the household in small practical ways that made her life easier without requiring discussion. He was, she thought, extraordinarily good at this. In September of 1884, their son was born. They named him James Gordon Kendrick for Andrew's father and hers. He was a red-faced, furious, entirely healthy boy who arrived, as Matilda later described it, with clear opinions about the process that he communicated at volume. Clara Kendrick was present at the birth and was so moved by the arrival of her first grandchild that she sat down on the porch and wept, and then immediately began giving instructions about what the baby needed, which involved a great deal of food and a specific blanket she had apparently been making since winter. Andrew held his son for the first time and went very quiet. Not the professional quiet, not the managed quiet, but the quiet of a man standing at the edge of something so much larger than anything he had planned for that words had temporarily failed him. He looked at Matilda over the baby's head with an expression she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. "Thank you," he said. It was simple and direct and exactly right. "He looks like you," she said. He looks like himself, Andrew said. He's his own person already. That's going to be a lot of work, she said. He smiled. Yes, he said. I'm looking forward to every day of it. The year James turned 1, Everett Harlow sold the majority of his Harlow County holdings and moved to Houston. No announcement was made and no reason was given. The Harlow family attorneys closed their local office. The bank changed its name. The stone arch with the family name above the entrance was replaced by a plain stone arch with the name of the county. The town that had been built to glorify a name quietly began the process of belonging to itself instead. Andrew heard about it on a Tuesday morning in November when a man came into his office and told him, and he came home that evening and told Matilda, and she sat at the kitchen table with James on her lap gnawing on a wooden spoon, and considered this for a moment. Just like that, she said. The journalist's piece ran in 2 Austin papers and 1 in San Francisco, Andrew said. And apparently, the state legislature has been looking at property practices in this county for a while now. When it became clear that a court had ruled against him on the Underwood matter, I suspect the calculation changed. The cost became greater than the benefit. That's how men like Everett Harlow make decisions, Andrew said, sitting down across from her. Everything is a calculation. When you stopped being the path of least resistance and started being the person who was going to cost him more than the land was worth, the math changed. I hope the Ruiz family knows, she said quietly. I've written to them, he said. They can't have their house back, but the people who burned it are no longer protected. She nodded. James looked up at her with his father's dark eyes and then returned his attention to the spoon, which he clearly felt had not yet yielded all its secrets. I want to do something with the South Canyon section, she said. The part with the springs Guillermo showed me. I've been thinking about it. Tell me. Water rights in this county are still the central question for the smaller ranchers and farmers, the ones who don't have their own water sources. I want to establish a formal water access arrangement for the families in the south end of the county, a legal covenant that guarantees access to the canyon springs in exchange for stewardship of the canyon land. Not a sale, a covenant. Something that can't be bought away or litigated away. Andrew looked at her. He was doing the careful thinking she knew so well by now. Brent can draft it, he said. It would need to be recorded with the state land office to be binding. I'll write to him tomorrow. It won't make you rich, he said. I'm not trying to be rich, she said. I'm trying to use what my father left me in a way that's worth having. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Gordon Underwood was right about you, he said. He said you were honest and determined. What he should have said was that you were extraordinary. She looked at him across the table, across their son and the wooden spoon and the evening light in the Canyon House kitchen, across the year and more of building this life together. He also sent me to you, she said. So his judgment was clearly excellent. Andrew laughed, and it was the real laugh. The open one that she had learned over 2 years of living beside him was the truest sound he made. 3 years after Matilda's arrival in Harlow, the canyon land had become what she had imagined it might be. The house was settled and comfortable and full. The kitchen garden produced tomatoes that Clara Kendrick, in a significant endorsement, said were competitive with her own. The South Canyon Springs were under covenant, and 11 families in the South County had water access they had not had before, and the agreement had been recorded in Austin and blessed by the state land office and was, as Brent had said with satisfaction, essentially bulletproof. James was 2 years old and walking with the particular determined energy of a child who finds the world endlessly interesting and mobility an urgent and recent gift. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, which Andrew said was both wonderful and clearly going to make their lives very interesting, and Matilda agreed on both counts. The school year of 1885 began in September with the largest enrollment the Harlow School had ever had, partly because Matilda had persuaded the board to establish a second classroom in a renovated building next to the original schoolhouse, and partly because word had spread through the community that the schoolteacher at Harlow was the kind of teacher who made children feel that learning was something done for their own benefit rather than someone else's. On a Tuesday morning in October, Matilda arrived at the sheriff's office before school because she had gotten into the habit of stopping there in the mornings, even years into the routine, because the mornings she stopped were better than the mornings she didn't, and she was honest enough with herself to act on this knowledge. Andrew was already behind his desk, reading correspondence. He looked up when she came in. "The postmaster left something for you," he said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "It came to my office because apparently Mr. Prescott still has us filed under the old address from the partnership days." She picked it up. It was from a law firm in San Francisco, a firm she didn't recognize. She opened it. It was a letter from the attorneys representing the Prescott Cattle Concern, the company that had offered Everett Harlow the considerable sum for the water rights 3 years ago. Prescott's business had expanded, and he was now operating in 3 states. He was aware that the canyon land was now under a single owner. He was aware of the covenant. He was interested, his attorneys wrote, in a conversation about a legitimate and mutually beneficial partnership arrangement that would respect the existing covenant while providing significant investment in the development of the canyon property's agricultural and ranching potential. Matilda read the letter twice. Then she set it on Andrew's desk. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed, reading it over. "It's interesting." "It is. I'm not going to do anything that compromises the covenant." "I know that," he said, "but a legitimate partnership." She sat down across from him. "An actual one with proper documentation and equal terms and no secrets." "The way your father's was supposed to be," Andrew said. "Yes," she looked at the letter. "I'm going to write back and ask for details, and then I'm going to ask Thomas Brent to review everything before I make any decisions." "That is the precise correct order of operations," Andrew said. "I have learned from a very methodical man," she said. He looked up from the letter with that expression she loved, the one that was warm and genuine and his. "Write to Brent today," he said. "And then go teach school because your students are going to wonder where you are." She stood up and retrieved her bag. At the door she paused. "Andrew," he looked up. "3 years ago I came in that door with a deed I didn't understand and a problem I didn't know the shape of, and you pulled out a chair." "I remember," he said quietly. "I have thought about that moment a great many times," she said. "The chair, the way you sat down, the way you looked at me like you were deciding whether to trust me with something." She paused. "I'm very glad you did." He got up from behind his desk and crossed to her, and kissed her in the doorway in the morning light, which was something he would not have done in the early days when the management was thicker, and which he did now without any consideration for who might be walking past on the street because he was, as he had promised her, working on being less managed. "Go," he said against her temple. "You have a classroom full of children waiting." "I know." She didn't immediately go. "I'm going to tell you something." "Tell me." "We're expecting again." He went still again the way he had the first time, and then the same wide-open look came over his face. "When?" he said. "Late spring, I think." "April or May." He pulled her into his arms and held her, and she could feel the smile in him even without seeing it. "James is going to have opinions about this," he said. "James has opinions about everything," she said. "He gets it from both sides." Andrew laughed and held her a moment longer. Then she pulled back and straightened her collar and picked up her bag and walked down the street toward the school in the October morning light. Behind her, she heard Andrew Kendrick go back into his office, and she knew without looking that he was smiling. The second child arrived in May of 1886, a girl this time, who they named Clara Maria Kendrick, for her grandmothers on both sides. She arrived with considerably more serenity than her brother had, which Clara Kendrick said was because she knew she was being named after someone who had things organized, and which Andrew said was probably just personality, and which Matilda said was irrelevant because the outcome was wonderful either way. James was 3 when his sister arrived, and after an initial period of adjustment during which he communicated his complex feelings primarily through strategic behavior around the wooden spoon collection, he came around entirely and became, by summer, the most devoted older brother in Harlow County, which was both charming and slightly exhausting because it involved a good deal of very emphatic supervision of Clara's activities. The Prescott partnership had, over the preceding months, been negotiated into a form that Matilda was satisfied with, and Thomas Brent had called the most well-protected property covenant he had ever seen outside of a city law office. Prescott's investment financed the development of the canyon's ranching potential, while the water covenant remained inviolable. The 11 families in the South County had their water access permanently secured. The canyon land itself began to produce in earnest, and the production went into a household and a community in ways that Matilda felt honored what her father had originally seen in it. On a September evening of that same year, when the children were asleep, and the canyon was settling into its night sounds, and the fire in the main room was burning low, Matilda sat beside Andrew on the wide stone hearth and looked at her father's deed in its frame on the wall. The signatures were still clear. Gordon Underwood, Cornelius Harlow, 2 names, the beginning of everything. "I've been thinking about writing to the Ruiz family again," she said. "Not just a letter, an invitation. There's enough on this land now that if they wanted to come back, there might be something for them here." "They may not want to come back," Andrew said. "The history is hard." "I know, but the invitation should be made." She paused. It was their water, too, before it was anyone's deed. He looked at her, he took her hand. "I'll write to them with you," he said. "I know you will," she said. The fire crackled. Outside, the canyon was dark and alive with the sounds of the night, the creek below, the owls in the cedars, the wind moving through the gap in the canyon walls. Above the house the stars were dense and brilliant, and the same as they had always been, unchanged by any of the human story happening below them. Matilda Underwood Kendrick leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the quiet house with the deed on the wall, and the children sleeping and the land all around them breathing in the dark. She thought about walking into a brick-walled office in November of 1882 with cold fingers and a folded deed, and a heart that was already half broken by the weight of what she didn't know. She thought about a second name she hadn't expected to find. She thought about a sheriff who had pulled out a chair without ceremony, without performance, who had simply sat down and told her everything because a man she loved had trusted him too. She thought about all the things that had come from that moment. The canyon house, the children. This life, built from scratch on ground that was hers by right and by choice, and by the particular grace of having found, in the middle of a fight she hadn't asked for, a man who pulled out chairs for women with cold fingers and dark news, who held secrets for the sake of the people who would one day need them, who was honest even when honesty was inconvenient and steady even when steadiness required effort. Gordon Underwood had sent her west with a deed and a secret and a hope he had put in a letter to a man he trusted. He had hoped she would find Andrew worth finding. He could not have known the full shape of what she would find. But he had given her the door and she had walked through it, and on the other side was this. She was 32 years old and she was home. "Andrew," she said quietly, "you were worth finding." His arm tightened around her. His voice when he spoke was low and warm and entirely without management. "So were you," he said. The fire burned lower. The canyon held its sounds. The stars moved slowly in their ancient paths above the house in the canyon. And in the house, everything that mattered was safe and whole and exactly where it should be.